So good morning, everyone. Welcome to day 2 of this training. Glad to have you for today. So we'll just do a brief recap of yesterday. Yesterday we looked at method 3 for measuring profit shifting, as was presented by Bojan. This method looks at a global distribution of MNE profits and taxes. We also looked at a very good case study on country-by-country reporting presented by Peter, and it also brought out some good questions. We had a very good example from colleagues from Craig, who looked at Nigeria, and we are happy that Nigeria is one of the countries, so we hope there's a lot of learning and collaboration that will take place from there. So in terms of housekeeping rules, we have a simultaneous interpretation in Portuguese and in French. We request presenters kindly bear that in mind so that you can enable our participants from listening in Portuguese and French to pick up on the presentation and the discussions. With that, I would like us to start. It's 9:06. Bojan, please, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. Good morning, everyone. It is a pleasure to be here with you today to join us on this second day of training on the profit shifting of multinational enterprises. Just before we move ahead, I would just like to check with some technical issues. I see that some of the recordings are on. Ekaterina, maybe if you can just check if you're recording. If you can start recording, please, in your languages. My
I
teams.
did.
Okay, perfect. I see it now.
But I cannot hear the Russian translator for the moment.
Okay.
Все, теперь слышно, да.
Okay, perfect, great. Okay, so let us start with today's work. So the schedule for today is essentially that first I'll be making a presentation of the method number 4, as we call it, which is comparing multinational enterprises to comparable domestic units, and identifies the profit shifting. So this is the method that is explained in the guidelines, and I'm okay, so and I'm going to describe this method as it is in the guideline. Then we're going to have a little bit of a break, and after the break we will have essentially the expert on the method join us with his case study on the Italian MNEs, and also with some practical guidance and an example to lead us through the method. So I'm gonna just stop my video just to ensure a better bandwidth. And so maybe we can just kickstart this. So yesterday we looked at one of the methods that is addressing the multinational enterprises profit shifting, and today we're looking at the other one that is outlined in the guidelines. I don't know who of you have been present yesterday, but just a short introduction. In the beginning, we have mentioned that, of course, when we addressed illicit financial flows, and of course related to that, within the tax and commercial illicit financial flows, the so-called aggressive tax avoidance or profit shifting by multinational enterprises, our first thoughts go to an aggregated statistics such as balance of payments or FDIs or foreign direct investments, and those data sources and analysis at such aggregated level could, of course, provide some sort of understanding and indication of the size of profit shifting. However, they do not, at such an aggregated level, allow for a more disaggregated or detailed insights and breakdown into various categories of illicit financial flows. To that end, of course, in order to statistically measure tax and commercial illicit financial flows, more detailed or alternative methodologies have been proposed, as in our guidelines. The research has, of course, been abundant, and specifically so, I believe, in the last few years, with some of the data sources being more prominently available or publicly available. And three main approaches have been, somehow rooted in the research. So one is the profit misalignments. So it's looking at how the profits that are being declared by a certain MNE unit in a particular country, how they relate to their economic activity. If a unit has, most of its employees and most of its capital and so on in one country, but only reports a tiny share of profits that the whole MNE is generating, this is a sign that, the profits are not aligned with economic activity, therefore a sign of profit shifting. The other stream is basing on its work on the tax semi-elasticity, and this is what we have looked into yesterday, essentially trying to understand tax incentives to shift profits, but also accounting for labor and capital inputs of a particular unit. Today, we are addressing the third stream of research, which is essentially comparing multinational enterprises to domestic enterprises. The main premise behind this method being that if there were no profit shifting, multinational and domestic units would be similar in terms of their profitabilities. So building on that, we are gonna start with presenting the method that is outlined in the guidelines. So going step by step, addressing some of the limitations and the calculation phases. And of course, I would prefer, if there are any questions as we move along, you are of course free to wait until the end so we can have a Q&A session in the end. We can already have a few things of discussions in between. Particularly today, what I think would be actually even better is to save all your questions for later when Federico is joining us, and he will be going through the step-by-step presentations himself. So he may be a best person to address all the questions and concerns we might have as we move along. So the method number 4, as we call it, is the MNEs versus comparable non-MNEs or domestic units profit shifting. So similar to some other methods that are addressing the illicit financial flows, this method is grounding its concept on the idea of deviation from normality. So something abnormal is happening when we compare MNEs and non-MNEs, so domestic units, and specifically when we might look into, this is just a chart to show us sort of an indication that, when we compare MNEs and non-MNEs, we see right away that there are differences. So we see it in labor productivity, but also in export and import ratios to turnover or costs. So there are differences in MNEs and domestic units. So we need to account for that and, filter out all, let's say, good reasons why this is happening, good meaning legitimate, and then the rest would be the amount of the profit shifting or the reasons that the units are profit shifting. So this is a bottom-up method, which means that we are starting at the lower level using the granular microdata, which we will see later on, and then slowly building up the entire results, which is a preferred method to measure tax and commercial IFFs or any other statistical measurement for that matters. This method it's processed in 2 major phases. So phase number 1 is looking to identify the tax avoiding multinational enterprises. So the method essentially identifies abnormalities in structural and economic variables of MNEs in comparison to the behavior of similar domestic enterprises. So this similar in comparison to the similar, so like with like, is very crucial in this method. Moreover, so using the method, we are essentially exploiting the information that is coming from two types of comparisons. First one is between MNEs and non-MNEs, and the second one is also within MNEs. So within the group of MNEs, so which is essentially being very strong and saying that it does not treat all MNEs equally. So not all MNEs are profit shifting. Some of them are, some of them aren't. If you remember from the yesterday's presentation, it was also a research that has shown that larger MNEs contribute to the most or the majority of profit shifting. So not all MNEs are the same, and this is a very important conceptual part of this approach. The second phase is, of course, then addressing the measure of profit shifting itself. You may remember, so when we are estimating the illicit financial flows, specifically with reference to reporting to the SDG indicator 1641, we have to come up with a measure of profit shifting or a total or dollar value of illicit financial flows, both inward and outward. So this is important also to keep in mind. So the method is essentially estimating the IFFs as a profit shifting, as a difference between profits that are declared and the one that they should have been declared. So we have this again with all other measures or methods to address illicit financial flows. We have the actual or the observed status, and then we have a theoretical part, which is how it should have been. And of course, we're trying to measure the difference between those two. It was also mentioned previously that so illicit financial flows by definition are hidden, which means that we will always have problems directly identifying illicit financial flows. We are merely observing the traces that they leave in official economy or official statistics. But of course, we have to make sure that those observations are as accurate as possible. Another important element of this method is that it is using a so-called vertical strategy. So it is focusing only on the MNEs and their units in a selected country. So we are going to have, and we're going to hear later on from Federico on the case in Italy. So we're only focusing on MNEs in Italy. So alternative would be to focus on all firms of a given MNE in all the countries that the group operates, which is something that is not usually available for a statistical system. Therefore, it is very hard to apply it. But to that end, the method that we are proposing here is using the so-called vertical strategy. Usually all the methods, of course, have some pluses and have some minuses. And of course, the limitations of our method are, of course, present as well. So the first one is essentially, putting a challenge to comparing multinationals and domestic units, because differences between those two groups could be driven by a range of different factors. So beyond the IFFs or the BEPS, so the base erosion and profit shifting. There could be differences in productivity, in economies of scale, and so on. So this is a limitation that has to be addressed at some point. Then moving ahead, we could still have problems with applying the method in smaller economies. Why? Because there might be more difficult to identify an appropriate domestic match for the subsidiaries of large multinationals. So if in small economies there might be smaller number of units and we may not be able to find a proper comparison group, but there has to be also one point that needs to be clarified here, is that when we compare local units and the MNEs, we have to make sure that we are not comparing the entire MNE in terms of its size, but we are only looking at the really the local unit of an MNE that is being compared to domestic companies. Another limitation of the method is that a proposed set of so-called matching variables includes mainly ratios. There are a few that are not ratios, such as the number of employees or a sector or even region. So this could potentially result in a poor match in terms of the size. Now, the main drawback of the method in light of the SDG reporting is that it can only report either outward IFFs or inward IFFs. So the country first needs to be defined as being, we could say, prone to either profit shifting, so outside, so the profits are being moved outside of the country. So we are looking at the outward IFFs, or the country could be classified as an inward IFF flows. So this is something that has to be addressed right from the start when we do apply the method, which means that a country as a whole can only produce one or the other given the concepts of the method. Of course, all these limitations do not render this method, useless. Far from that. Rather, no, we have to come up with some sort of mitigations or mitigation actions to overcome those limitations. So we mentioned that when we compare MNEs and the non-MNEs, because of differences, the two groups could be coming from different factors such as productivities or economies of scale. So this drawback can somewhat be eased by forcing a control group into the same size classes. Moreover, when we said that there is a problem with smaller economies, we could somehow bypass this problematic issue by comparing MNEs units to either an average of a domestic firm, so of all the domestic firms, or in extreme cases, or as a solution of the last resort, we could compare all MNE units to all domestic firms. So this could be seen as a way out if there are not enough cases in a country. So we earlier mentioned that, so one of the limitations was that matching variables would be including mainly ratios. So the issue could be eased by imposing that each domestic firm in the control group is included in the same size class. So this is one way how we can, go around this limitation. If data permits, or if data are available, another way to control for this size-related comparability could be represented or applied by including size of assets, if this variable is available for all the units that we are observing. Okay, let's move on. I'm sorry, I'm going to have to apologize just for a second. I have some sort of a family emergency. I'll be right back with you in a second. Please bear with me. Thank you.
Okay, no worries, no worries. We'll give you a minute or so, maybe two.
Okay, I'm back. Apologies and thank you for this. We have some sicknesses in the family, and I hope it will go by so fast. Okay, so now that we know the concept of the method, now we can, of course, start looking at what type of data, what data do we actually need in order to apply this method. So this method is using microdata that are available to the national statistical offices. Usually, but definitely something that should be more readily available. You may remember yesterday we had a discussion, which data source to use. Should we be actually using the globally available data sources, such as the OECD's country by country reporting? What is the reliability or trustworthiness of those data sources? Of course, whenever possible, we propose to use nationally owned data sources, and today's method is essentially relying solely and fully on nationally available data sources. So these nationally available microdata that are available so in the national statistical systems, of course, can then also be linked to other areas such as the national accounts, but they are deemed somewhat more complete relative to, let's say, other external data sources. So the source data would include economic and structural variables of a particular unit, such as the value added, research and development spending, salaries or ratio of salaries to cost, and so on. Structural business statistics or other relevant sources with firm level data could be used. So it is important that we know that, even though we might have structural business statistics published and so on, it is required that these are used at a firm level. So we're looking at microdata at the firm level. So this is, I think, is important. Additionally, or like supplementary or sometimes alternatively, administrative data sources could be used, such as data on taxable profits, so directly from the tax returns. In some of the research, it has actually been shown that those data may be better suited than financial accounts or accounting profits. I think it was a case in the UK when they showed that the foreign multinational subsidiaries are more prone to report positive profits in their accounts. However, at the same time, they are reporting zero taxable profits in their tax returns. So, using the accounting data would produce a bias so a downward bias in estimating the profit shifting. So this is important. So whenever there are chances to use tax returns, so to provide really direct data on taxable profits, this would be preferred. So all these microdata are then further integrated with other statistics on these firms, like international trade by products and trading partners, and position within multinational enterprises. So those could be sourced from ideally some sort of a groups register, like a national groups register if it exists. It could be used regional groups or international groups registers. Sometimes, if available, FATS, so foreign affiliate trade statistics, could be used. And what is, I think, also very important today, but also what we discussed yesterday, is the involvement of so-called large cases unit within the national statistical offices. So those units are particularly dealing with multinational enterprises, and they have a lot of expertise in understanding how things are going around with these units. So this interpretation support, both in terms of input data, but also in terms of outputs, so our results, is extremely important. So experts should be brought into the game when we are essentially applying this method. So the main phases, so earlier we mentioned, so there are two phases of applying this method. Now, before we go to those two phases, there is a phase 0. As you may remember, we mentioned earlier that the method needs to identify the country as a whole as either inward or outward IFF generating or collecting. And therefore, this phase 0 is this identification of a country. This is essentially going to inspect whatever tax practices are, whatever macroeconomic variables could be used for the classification of the country. That was essentially a case, and I believe it might be a good way to start is to use the so-called dashboard approach of BEPS indicators. So BEPS, base erosion and profit shifting indicators developed by OECD. So they may support some evidence in trying to get an idea whether our country is outward or inward illicit financial flows, so outward or inward BEPS or profit shifting. We have an example here of analyzing those indicators of profit shifting by MNEs in Canada. So they're applying the two BEPS indicators to understand whether a country is, so how is Canada performing in terms of MNEs profit shifting. So they look at the mismatches between, financial and real economic activity using various macroeconomic data. And the first indicator is looking at the mismatches between the stocks of Canadian outward FDI and of GDP of the receiving countries. So this chart clearly shows that a high level or a higher level of Canadian outward FDI was directed to countries with favorable corporate tax rates. So we see the dark blue are the countries with favorable corporate tax rates, and then we have all other countries. Now, what is a favorable corporate tax rate? We could call those countries as tax havens or anything that would offer our units or our MNEs lower taxes to be paid. And we see that to those countries, our outward FDI accounts for 22%, whereas their size in terms of GDP is only 0.3%. So this is clearly a sign that something may be going on in terms of how the outward FDIs of Canadian MNEs are being conducted, apart from true economic activity. Rather, it seems like it might be something else leading to favorable corporate tax rates. Another indicator that they have applied is indicator 1B, which is looking at mismatches between assets, employment, and sales. Again, comparing countries with favorable tax rates. The results of this analysis has shown that foreign subsidiaries reported having 23 employees per $1 billion of assets. So in countries with favorable corporate taxes. For other countries, this number was 270. So this is clearly suggesting that investments in countries with favorable corporate tax rates by those subsidiaries of MNEs in Canada are not driven by real economic factors. Rather, they're driven by tax incentives. So combining all this, of course, overall, the Canada can be interpreted as an outward IFF's country. So the profits are being shifted out of the country. And this is important when we actually move into phases 1 and 2 of the actual application of the method. So, in most of the cases, the countries would probably be categorized as outward IFF countries, except if we're looking at, tax havens, which are obviously an inward IFFs. That's why the main part of the presentation of the method will be focusing on the outward IFF country. So the first phase we said is the identification phase. So we're trying to identify the profit shifting MNEs. So this phase is processed further on in 2 steps. First is the between comparison, and then we have the within comparison. So the between comparison is applying the so-called propensity score matching, which I'm not going to go into details, and Federico is an expert in this field, so he will definitely be a better person to walk you through this. So essentially, we are applying this propensity score matching. So for each MNE and the most efficient control group of the domestic units. This characterization, so to identify the most efficient control group, is based on various variables such as the territory, economic activity, employment, indicators of internationalization, structure of costs and revenues, and so on. A next thing to do is to see how we essentially have a clustering between MNEs with normal and abnormal behavior, and how we compare those to similar or comparable domestic units. So this is being based or processed using a so-called proxy that has 2 values. It has a value of 1 if we have a suspect. So this is an indicator of abnormality. In these cases, EBIT to turnover ratio is lower than the average of the control group. So EBIT is earnings before interest and taxes. So EBIT to turnover ratio has been used as a measure of profitability, so to say. So whenever this profitability is lower than the average of the control group, so remember the control group is the domestic control group. So whenever MNE has a lower profitability than the comparable domestic, this is marked as a suspect, as an indicator of abnormality. So the proxy has a value of 1. And vice versa, proxy has a value of 0 if there is no suspect or no suspicion of profit shifting, where this EBIT to turnover ratio is actually higher or equal to the average of the control group of domestic units. The second part of this first identification phase is the so-called within comparison. So this is processed using another methodological approach, the ROC or the ROC, so the receiver operating characteristics. Again, I'm not going to discuss the technical details. It will be Federico covering for this, thankfully. So this within comparison is processed to determine the extent to which status that was outlined by the proxy binary variable from previous step, if you remember. So we had 0 and 1. So how can this be confirmed when other variables such as economic performance, strategies, or contextual variables are taken into account? So put differently, starting from the proxy variable in the previous step, we are using this ROC analysis to define the final clustering between tax avoiding and non-tax avoiding MNEs. So to apply this, first, the so-called classifier is represented by a composite indicator. So this is built from the set of various characteristics. So we have EBIT to turnover ratios, we have value added to turnover ratio, we have R&D spending, we have exports to turnover ratio, and so on. And then we also have ratios to total costs, such as the royalties, salaries, services, imports, and so on. So this composite indicator, when we have it, we are applying this composite indicator for a specific stratum. So we are observing those indicators by economic activity. So in different strata, to allow for various economic activities having different characteristics. So to account for those things, we are processing this composite indicator in different strata. So for each of such stratum, the composite indicator, so this is the big I, is constructed using a factor analysis. On the whole set of characteristics that we have included, and then it's being aggregated using the number of factors that are as a result of the factor analysis. In this case, we have two factors as a result of factor analysis. Please bear in mind that, of course, the number of factors may differ from case to case. As a general rule in applying the factor analysis is that we should try and cover at least or explain at least 80% of the total variance. So this might differ 2, 3, 1 factor. In our case, the one that we're observing here, 2 factors have been identified for this composite indicator. So next step is essentially using both the composite indicator and the proxy variable from the previous step in a logit model. So essentially what we are doing, we were saying that the dependent variable of the logit model is a proxy variable with the value of 1, so as a suspect, and explanatory variable is this composite indicator. As a result of this analysis, so the threshold observation is identified. And this threshold, so the value of its composite indicator, is then interpreted as a threshold value above or below which other MNEs can be classified in the following way. If I, so a specific MNE, has a value of indicator that is lower than this threshold value, the MNE is considered as tax avoiding. On the other hand, MNE is considered as non-tax avoiding if the value of its composite indicator is higher or equal to this threshold value. So this is very similar to the proxy that we had before. So if profitability is lower than what it should have been, we are considering this unit as a tax avoiding unit. And now we reach the second phase, which is the measurement phase. So for each tax avoiding MNE units from the previous phase, so the unit that has been confirmed to be tax avoiding, we have to provide an amount of the profit that is being shifted. So the amount of profits that are being shifted is being essentially determined as a difference between a theoretical profits, so the profits that the unit should have been declaring or producing, and an actually declared profits. So the measurement of BEPS or of IFFs, of profit shifting, is carried out by essentially increasing the EBIT to turnover ratio. So this is XH so long then to obtain that our value of indicator equals the threshold value. And of course, keeping other variables unchanged. So this is an algebraic formula or result how to get this value, but essentially the idea is, so we know that the profitability of profit shifting MNE is lower than it should have been, so lower than the threshold value. So let's increase this profitability, and we increase it until we reach what we think should have been a theoretical profit. And this difference, I think Federico is going to show a very nice chart to show this. This difference is treated as one part of the profits that are being shifted. So this difference, this is the adjusted EBIT to turnover ratio, is then being compared to the declared value. So this difference is then being multiplied by the turnover. Remember, X is the value of EBIT to turnover. So we have calculated the differences between EBIT to turnover ratio, so how much we should be increasing this ratio, and in order to produce how much profits have been actually in monetary terms shifted, we have to multiply this by the turnover. So this formula is then being used to calculate the the amount of outward illicit financial flows in a country. Now, I'm just going to very briefly present how the calculation will differ if our country in phase 0 is being classified as an inward illicit financial flows country. So we are now essentially looking at the inflows of profits, which means that our multinational enterprises are observing higher levels of profits than normal levels of similar domestic units. You may remember that in outward profit shifting, the MNE units are exhibiting lower profitability than domestic units, given their characteristics like the labor inputs, the activities, and so on. In the inward IFFs, the picture is reversed. So MNEs are observing higher levels of profits than normal levels of similar non-MNEs. The focus in our analysis would now switch from costs to revenues. When we are observing in the previous example, outward illicit financial flows, so multinational units shifting profits out of a country, they are concentrating essentially on the costs. So they are trying to, artificially increase their costs. So, the costs for royalties are going up. So whatever things we're buying from our sister units abroad cost so much more than they should have, and so on. So we are trying to increase the cost, which would then in turn reduce our profits. When we discuss profit shifting, it is never really the case that we get to the end and we declare the profits and then the profits are actually being shifted. No, so the parts that lead to the profits are being shifted. That's why costs are being, artificially manipulated. On the other hand, so when we are inward IFFs, when we are inflowing profits, we are focusing on the structure of the revenues. Oh, our revenues are so much higher and so on. This would, of course, so this shift from the focus not so much on the costs, but on the revenues would lead to in some cases, the inverse relations of structural characteristics with the suspect. You may remember previously in the identification phase, in the between analysis, the proxy was one as an indicator of an abnormality if the profitability was lower than the average of the control group. In this case, it is vice versa. So it is reversed. So the EBIT to turnover ratio for a suspect is actually higher than the average of the control group. And then, of course, in the next phase, so the things in the concept, they stay the same. So we're still having the classifier, we're still having the composite indicator. However, some of the signs or some of the variables have a reverse sign when they are being brought into this composite indicator. So we have reverse signs for EBIT to turnover ratio, value added to turnover ratio. Then we have also a little bit of changes. So we have royalties, to turnover ratio before it was royalties to costs. We have services to turnover ratio before it was services to cost, and so on. So there are a few of those things that are different. I'm not going to spend time and present all those here. In the case that you end up with your country being identified as a inward IFFs, then we have a box 5 in the guidelines that is going through all these in more detail, so you can take a look also there. Now, in the second part, of course, the measurement, it is the story is conceptually the same, except that it is slightly reversed, right? So the X variable, so this EBIT to turnover ratio for MNEs that are considered as collecting BEPS or inward IFFs, this value should be higher than the threshold value. So exactly the opposite as before. Therefore, this difference between the threshold and the actual declared value is going to be negative. And as we need the inward IFFs to have a positive value, we have to add a minus in front of that. But essentially, the formula is the same, just that the logic behind it is slightly reversed. Okay, I think I have used up my time to present this. I hope this presentation made some sense. I think I would like to stop here and hand over back to you, Susan, if there may be any specific questions, or you know, maybe we can save some of the questions for later for Federico. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bojan. Thank you for that very detailed presentation. We can take a few questions. I think we have about 8 minutes to 10. If there are questions, comments, inquiries, you can write them in the chat or raise a hand. I don't see Bojan back. Hello, Bojan, are you back? Okay, he's not around. So what we can do is resume, go into the next presentation, and then Bojan will be able to take up the questions that were asked during the break. So thank you. Welcome back, colleagues.
Hello. Kindly, I have lost my channels. Kindly assign me as an interpreter, Aziz.
Aziz, okay. Jean-Philippe, you had Aziz?
Wait, let me text Jean-Philippe because he's not here. Let me text him.
Okay, that is fine. That is fine. I've regained them. It's okay.
Oh, you did? So
yes.
Okay.
It's good. It's good.
Okay. So is the other interpretation working fine? French and Portuguese? Okay. I think we should start. So welcome back.
Redémarrer, bienvenue.
Welcome back, participants. We shall go straight into our next presentation. The next presentation will be made by Federico Sallusti. He'll be looking at measuring BEPS, M&Es vis-a-vis the comparable non-MNE methodology using the case study from Italy. So over to you, Federico. You're welcome. Kindly introduce yourself and then we'll go straight into the presentation. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. I would like to thank Bojan for his presentation, which has been very comprehensive and very clear. My work today is divided in 2 parts. The first one is in the first one I will present the conceptual framework, while in the second I try to go through the practice of the method by showing each steps, the data sets and the results and so on, so you can have a panoramic view of the method. Let's say 2 words about me. I work in the National Statistical Office of Italy, Istat, and I'm the responsible of the team that estimates value added by economic activity, both regular and underground. So my team is dealing with different kind of problems. So also related to the non-observed economy. So this work is a this method comes from an experimental study I'm doing about base erosion and profit shifting. Actually, we don't estimate officially these figures, but the idea is to explore the possibility of having unofficial estimates of base erosion and profit shifting. So until now, this is only an experimental study. If I can take the screen, I think so. Yes. Okay. Let me know just if you can see the screen. Can you see the screen?
Yes, Federico, we can see your screen, but not yet in full.
Now you can, I think you can
yes.
See the screen in presentation mode.
Yes.
Okay, so let's start. This is the outline of the first presentation. So I will go through the method in all components. So from data sources to the overview, the selection and the correction. Then I will present the preliminary results for Italy. Please take into account that these results refer to an update of the former work to 2019. The first work was referred to 2015. Then in the last week, we updated the work to take into account the last available set of microdata. Obviously, the last part of the presentation will cover conclusions and the open issues that also Bojan signaled in his presentation. This is a first insight of the complexity of international trade, which is the field in which the base erosion and profit shifting phenomenon is played. As you can see, this is a very simple representation of the international trade taken from the WIOD database, which reports the input-output tables for 40 countries. So as you can see from the graph, there are a lot of commercial relationships among countries. The thickness of the lines represent the relevance, the economic relevance of the exchanges, and the color of the countries represent different clusters of countries. As you can see in the left part of the screen, you have the red one, which are mainly non-European countries, with the rest of the world, which is a sort of other countries. And in the right part of the screen, you can see mainly European countries, which are broken down in 3 different clusters. The orange one is related to Scandinavian countries, which represent in some way a geographical cluster in which the pattern of commercial relationships is in some way closed. Then we have 2 other clusters that represents mainly Western European countries and the Central Eastern European countries. As you can see from this graph, Italy, France, and Germany represent in some way a bridge between the 2 green and blue clusters of European countries. Stepping from a general representation to a peculiar representation of how Italian industries are involved in international trade, you can see that in the left part of the screen, so that the graph is built up taking into account a gravital algorithm that tend to make closer the nodes that are more connected to each other. So as you can see in the left part of the screen of the graph, you can find foreign countries and the most internationally connected Italian industries, while in the right part of the graph, you can find more domestic focused industries in the Italian business system. Sorry, there are questions. No, I think not. So may you close the microphone? Okay, thank you.
Sorry, Federico. Yeah, it took me some time to find them.
Okay, sorry. Okay, that's fine.
Please go ahead.
No, I don't know. I don't know if I didn't know if it was a question or something else. So, okay. As you can see, also in this representation, you can have some cluster, qualitative cluster in this representation that represents the way in which the position in which some Italian industries is with respect to the international trade. As you can see, you can define 2 different clusters of internationalized industries in the upper left and lower left part of the screen. Then you can have a central cluster, which in some way represent a bridge between internationalized and non-internationalized industries. Then you can see in the upper right part of the screen Italian industries that, although they are not internationalized, they are very close relationship with some foreign countries. In particular, those sectors represents the financial sectors, and they are more close to Great Britain, Luxembourg, and Ireland, which are in some way the European countries that are more connected with financial markets and headquarters for multinational enterprises. In this presentation, we are speaking about aggressive tax planning and the way in which these practices can be related to illicit financial flows and the control of this phenomenon by means of the SDG indicators. So aggressive tax planning by multinational is defined as a set of practices that aims at exploiting the mismatches and loopholes in the international tax framework in order to minimize the overall tax burden for multinational enterprises. As you can see, the European Commission in 2016 provide a definition of the boundaries of aggressive tax planning. As you can see from the figure, you can step from licit tax planning to tax evasion, which is considered to be illegal. And we have a central part of the graph that is defined as aggressive tax planning, which is in some way separated from both licit tax planning and tax evasion. Base erosion and profit shifting, so BEPS, can be generated by aggressive tax planning strategies through three main channels. The first one is represented by the debt management, which use the allocation of financial assets, so mainly debt and interests, in order to shift profits from high to low tax countries. The second channel is the use intangible, so non-financial assets, in order to shift profits by managing royalty payments, the allocation of R&D, and so on. The third channel is the more common in some way, and the more studied also, is the strategic transfer pricing, with use the trade of goods and services, so intra-group transaction mainly, in order to shift profits from high tax country to low tax countries. So base erosion and profit shifting is deemed to generate illicit financial flows, and this is the rationale for this presentation, which is linked to the measurement of illicit financial flows. The reduction of illicit financial flow is a claim for SDG indicator, and the monitoring indicator for the SDG 16.4 is the 16.4.1, which should monitor the total value of inward and outward illicit financial flows. So measuring BEPS is a part of this more comprehensive task. This presentation is focused on the MNEs versus comparable non-MNEs, which try to estimate the amount of base erosion and profit shifting in a given country, either if this country is generating or collecting profit shifting. So it is able separately, as Bojan rightly said, considering either the outward and the inward side of the coin. the main feature of the method is connected with the fact that the method starts from microdata, and from microdata which refers only to domestic enterprise. So in this way, this method is different from both other model-based approach and other bottom-up approach, which normally exploits macro or meso data and or microdata, which refers to both domestic and foreign enterprises. This is a problem because not always, so say never, you have a comprehensive data set of all the MNEs that are involved in all the MNE groups. So the problem is to have the available information in order to carry out the method. Normally, national statistical offices, I know to different extent, but normally they have information about domestic enterprise, both MNEs and non-MNEs. So the idea is to exploit this information in order to measure base erosion and profit shifting instead of having the need of gather information about enterprises that are resident in other countries. So according to 2019 data, the Italian business system is composed of about 4.4 million of enterprises. 140,000 are internationalized in the sense that they import or export. More than 44,000 units are in multinational groups. Slightly less than that, 18,000 belong to multinational group with foreign headquarters, and slightly less than 27,000 in multinational group with Italian headquarters and foreign affiliates. As you can see, in terms of incidence with respect to the total number of units, the presence of multinational enterprises is very heterogeneous by industry. As you can see, the majority of multinational enterprises operates in industrial sectors. As you can see, the highest incidence is in chemical and pharmaceutics, with more than 30% of units are in multinational groups. And there are also a strong incidence in energy, automotive, machinery, and electronics. As you can see, in services, the incidence is much lower. The only service sector which have a relevant incidence is telecommunication with 5.1%. The impact. As you can see, multinational enterprises represent only 1.2% of the total unit of the Italian business system, but their impact is very relevant. As you can see, they represent about 40% of value added, more than 45% in terms of turnover, only 22 in terms of workers, but over than 2/3 of imports and exports. If you want to compare MNEs and non-MNEs in terms of total, you can see that MNEs are by far bigger. As you can see, the average size is 75.6 workers versus 3.2. They are by far more productive, more than double in terms of per worker value added, but they have a lower value added turnover ratio. In terms of export and import intensity, they are 21.1 versus slightly less than 7%, and 20.2 versus 6.6. So in some way, MNEs are bigger, more productive, and more focused on international markets, but they generate lower value added with respect to in terms of ratio, value added turnover ratio with respect to non-MNEs. This indicator obviously can be linked to a wide set of factors, but it can also represent, I don't know, an evidence of a behavior. So this means that multinational enterprises have, in Italy at least, have a very high incidence of intermediate inputs with respect to the value they are able to generate from the use of these inputs. So, which is the database we use to carry out the method? The first one is the archive frame SBS, which include the information about the structural and economic variables for the whole set of Italian enterprises, both MNEs and non-MNEs. This data set includes information for all resident enterprises. The second one is the COETEC, which is which include the information about the imports and exports by product and origin destination country for all the firms that are internationalized. The third one is the Asia Group, which include the information about enterprises involved in domestic and foreign and multinational groups. By integrating these data sets, you can have a final database that reports the information about the economic structure of enterprises, the characteristic of its inclusion in international trade networks, and when applies the position within multinational groups. The method is composed by 3 phases. The first phase is the identification of the nature of the country in terms of BEPS generating or BEPS collecting. And this can be done using the OECD's dashboard of BEPS about BEPS indicators. The second is the selection of tax avoiding units among MNEs, which is carried out using the between and within comparison that Bojan explained in his presentation. And the third phase is the correction, in which the EBITDA to turnover ratio of tax avoiding units is adjusted in order to define the final amount of BEPS which has been generated by multinational enterprises in Italy. So the identification can be done using different indicators. Here I defined the 5 different indicators from this work done by Statistics Canada. So you can define the presence and the direction of BEPS from these 5 types of indicators. The first one is the mismatch between outward or inward, if you want to take into account BEPS collecting FDI and the GDP of the countries with favorable corporate income tax. So if there is a mismatch between the allocation of FDI and the economic activity of the countries, there is some other rationale for investing in this country, which may be represented by the favorable corporate income tax. So this is a suspect, if you want, indicator of suspect of BEPS. The same is true with respect to the mismatch between assets, employment, and sales of the multinational in countries with favorable corporate income tax. So if there is low assets, low employment, but a lot of sales in favorable in low tax countries, so also in this case there is a mismatch which can be explained by the presence of favorable corporate income tax with respect to economic factors. A third indicator is the high profit rates of the affiliates of MNE groups in low tax countries. The same is true for high profit rates in low tax location where affiliates of the MNE group are located. Then we have the fifth indicator, which is the effective tax rate of MNEs with respect to non-MNEs with similar characteristics. So also in this case, this comparison is taken into account in order to define a mismatch between the economic behavior of MNEs or non-MNEs facing different tax rates in different countries. When the identification of the nature of the country is done, we can step to the phase of selection, which is composed of 3 steps. The first one is to build up the control group of domestic firm, which is defined using propensity score matching. The second step is to define the proxy of suspect, which should stress possible abnormal behavior by MNEs. So in this way, we use a between comparison. So we compare the behavior of MNEs with the one of most similar non-MNEs. Then we use in the third step the ROC analysis to define the final cluster between tax avoiding and non-tax avoiding MNEs. So in this third step, we use the within comparison. In this third step, only multinational enterprises are taken into account, while in the second one, we were comparing MNEs with non-MNEs. So this is very important to take into account, to be reminded. The second step is MNEs versus non-MNEs. The third step is MNEs compared to among each other. So how we define the control group? So how we deal with the first two steps of selection? Propensity score matching is used to define the N. As you will see in this version of the work, I used 5 domestic units because you have to manage the trade-off between the number of units in the control group, but also the closeness of the characteristic of those units with respect to the given MNE. So in this case, I reduced the number of firms in the control group to gain more similarity with respect to the MNE taken into account. So I used this indicator, this confounding variable in the left, signaled in the left part of the screen. As Bojan said, most of them are ratios. So I try to control for the sides by imposing that all the firms in the control group should be in the same region, in the same industry at a very fine level, and in the same sales class. So propensity score matching allow to detect the control group, the 5 domestic enterprises, which represent the control group for each multinational enterprise. Then for each pair MNE control group, I define the proxy of suspect by comparing the EBIT to turnover ratio of the MNE with the average EBIT to turnover ratio of the control group. If the EBIT to turnover ratio for the MNE is lower than the average of the control group, the suspect is put equal to 1. So we have a suspect, we are in presence of an abnormal behavior, while if the EBIT to turnover ratio of the MNE is greater or equal to the average of the control group, the suspect, not suspect, suspect equal 0, proxy equal 0. So in this case, when we done the second step, for each MNE we have we can characterize each MNE with a 1 or 0 in terms of suspect. So we take into account all the MNEs, and for each of them we say, okay, this is suspect, this is not suspect. Then we have to refine this classification because obviously in the first step we take into account confounding characteristics between MNE and non-MNE. Then we have to take into account variables that are specific of MNEs. So as you can see, we select another set of variables which should capture the behavior, the specific behavior of MNEs and the specific channel they can use to shift profits, So as you can see, we have R&D spending, we have the share of royalties, we have the average taxation in foreign countries which they have headquarters or affiliates. We have the the ratio representing their behavior in terms of internationalization. So we try to take into account all the characteristics that may be relevant in detecting tax avoidance of MNEs. In this case, we have to define a composite indicator because the ROC analysis can be carried out only with only one variable. So we have to summarize the information of this set of variables first in two factors, then in a composite indicator. The composite indicator is obtained as a linear combination of the two factors, and we can see later how this can be done in practice. Then in this first presentation, let's say that each factor is aggregated taking into account the share of explained variance. So more importance is given to the factor that explain more variance among the variables we take into consideration. Then we run this logic model which use the proxy of suspect as dependent and the composite indicator as covariate. Let me see something about the ROC analysis now in order to make you more aware of what are we doing and what we'll do when we explore the practice of the method. The idea is that we are facing a classification problem. When you deal with classification problems, you have a dependent variable and a classifier. So in our case, the composite indicator is the classifier. So the variable we use to define the behavior of our observation. When you use a classifier in a classification problem, you can aim for outcomes. So you can detect true positive and true negatives, or you can detect false positive and false negative, according to the capability of the classifier to detect the real characteristic that define the true classification. So the ability of a classifier can be defined using these two indicators, which measure the ability of the classifier to detect true positive, which is defined as sensitivity, and then the measurement of the ability of the classifier to detect the true negative, which is defined as specificity. Normally, specificity is considered in its reciprocal expression, so 1 minus specificity, which measure the correct detection of false positive. ROC analysis is a representation of a particular representation of this classification problem, and when you have a logic model with a binomial dependent variable which reflect a given status, in our case the proxy, and a classifier that represent a single characteristic, even composite, as in our case, the distribution of the probability of detecting true positive and false positive can be represented by the ROC curve. This represents also the capability of the classifier of detecting the true classification. So if you take into account that the 45 line is the random selection, so all the space above of the cube above the 45 line degree line represent how the model is better than a random selection. So the more the area is large, the more our classifier is able to capture the dependent, the distribution of the dependent variable. So in this case, using this representation, we are able to define a cutoff over the distribution of the classifier, which can efficiently classify our observation. Mainly, we use this equation, which manage the trade-off between the errors. So we know that the probability of detecting true positive and the probability of detecting false positive in some way are opposite. So we have a trade-off to manage. This trade-off can be managed by deciding which is the relative weight we want to give to the two indicators. So if we want to detect all true positive irrespective to the number of false positive, we can set H equal 1. So we want to give all the weight to sensitivity. The opposite holds for specificity, but normally in this type of problem, we use 0.5. So in our case, we don't have a prior first best. So we say, okay, we want to be neutral with respect to errors, and we give the model the possibility to tell us which is the right classification, taking into account that we are allowing for both type of possible error, so detecting false positive or detecting false negatives. When we define this cutoff, we have the possibility of taking into account this figure. So let's say that on the horizontal axis, you have the value of the indicator, and then the density function of the values of the indicator over all the observation. We define that this is the threshold, so we are able to define the value of the indicator that represent the threshold between tax avoiding and non-tax avoiding. So tax avoiding enterprises, which is here represented by the dot, are obviously under the threshold. So we can adjust their economic variable in order to make its indicator coherent with the threshold. So when we adjust the EBIT to turnover ratio of MNEs, we are implicitly carrying this enterprise to the threshold. So the main idea is that when when a multinational enterprises is tax avoiding, his value of the composite indicator, which is here represented by the right part of the equation, of the first equation, is lower than the value of the threshold. So as we saw from the figure, our goal is to bring these all tax avoiding enterprises to have the value of its indicator at least equal to the threshold value defined by the ROC analysis. This is the adjustment equation. So we are obviously to take into account all the variables, all the loadings of the factors, all the weight we gave to the factors to build up the composite indicator. Here, the relevant thing is to understand that this adjustment depends on three main elements. The first one is obviously the value of the threshold. So the higher the threshold, the higher the adjustment, ceteris paribus. So in some way, the threshold define the contextual situation of the enterprises in terms of the stratum of the analysis, which is mainly represented by the sector. So maybe you can have a sector in which the threshold is higher, sector in which the threshold is lower. So this represents in some way the sectoral condition an M&E have to meet in order to be non-tax avoiding. The second element is represented by the second part of the numerator, which represent the weight of the variables that are not the EBIT to turnover ratio.
Hello?
Yeah.
Kindly mute microphone.
So the second part represent the effect of the variable that are not the EBIT to turnover ratio. So our goal variable in this adjustment. So the higher they roll in the composite indicator, the lower the need for adjusting the EBIT to turnover ratio. The third element is how the EBIT to turnover ratio affect the composite indicator. In this case, the higher their reactivity, the lower the adjustment. The lower the reactivity, the higher the adjustment. So this equation allows us to define the adjusted value of the EBIT to turnover ratio in order to bring the tax avoiding M&Es on the threshold. And the final amount of the adjustment is obtained by multiplying the difference between the adjusted and the declared value by the turnover in order to come back to a level variable from a ratio. This is the results from Italy. As you can see, we selected more than 60% of tax avoiding M&Es. The total adjustment is 38.2 billion euros, which represent about 2.1% of the Italian GDP. So is a very relevant figure. And as you can see, the incidence of the adjustment is about 45% of the declared EBIT, and the average adjustment is 1.4 million euros. So there is a sectoral breakdown that, if you want, you can see, but the real important element is the total in this case, because in this case we can define for Italy, obviously is a BEPS generating country. In this case, as you can see, the value of base erosion and profit shifting conceptually corresponds to the value of outward illicit financial flows. So in this case, the outward illicit financial flows for Italy is 38.2 billion euros. Let's conclude this first presentation by summarizing the results and the shortcoming of the method. So the method is able to measure profit shifting. So we obtain a figure, we obtain a reliable figure, also according to other estimates carried out using other models. So the method is reliable. Then the method is reliable by exploiting only the information about domestic firms, which is a very strong point, maybe the strongest point of the method. So we don't need to gather information from elsewhere. So this information is generally available from national statistical offices, and they are not obliged to gather information from other countries. The method, even though is not able to define in the same procedure inward and outward illicit financial flows, can be performed for either types of, for both types of country, with small changes in the procedure. So the main shortcomings are connected with the capability of the propensity score matching in detecting very, very similar domestic enterprises in the control group for the given MNE. This is a problem, but taking also into account that the propensity score matching is used only in the first part. So in this case, is used just to define the suspect. Then the real classification is done using only multinational enterprises. So the fact that there are obviously the other reasons that contribute to capture the behavior of MNEs that is impossible to find in domestic enterprises is a problem. On the one hand, obviously, it's right, but taking also into account that they are used only in one part of the procedure. Then the fact that the confounding variables may be unable to capture all the similarities is also deal with using the same size class the same economic sectors. So the problem exists. The problem can be okay. The model can be improved to overcome this problem, but it's impossible to exclude the problem. But the problem relates to only the first part of the selection, not in all. It doesn't affect all the selection. Another shortcoming is linked to the absence of variables that are related to debt and financial assets. Yes, sorry, there is a mistake here. It's not immaterial, but it's financial. That prevents the method to be able to capture the first channel of BEPS we saw in the introduction. So this method is unable to capture BEPS carried out by using debt management. The problem here is linked to the fact that the financial statements, at least in Italy, is not so. Unincorporated enterprises and branches are not obliged to compile the financial statement. So if I would to include these variables, I was in the situation in which I have to exclude a lot of observation from the data set. So I preferred to take into account all the MNEs, letting aside the problem of debt management, instead of taking into account debt management on a very smaller data set. So I concluded the first part of the presentation. So I don't know if there is questions, if we want to do a little break before stepping to the practice. So let me know.
Thank you. Thank you, Federico. Thank you for that quite detailed presentation. We can take questions before the next session. There was already a question. I don't know if Bojan wants to take this. The question that came in just before we went for break. So it came in. I'll just read it again. He said, Mr. Andishak Tuki, he said, please, I would like you to shed more light on the issue of control group as being a way to tackle the limitation of this method. Thank you. We can take more questions in the chat if there are any. Yeah,
maybe just very briefly to get back. I mean, first of all, hi, Federico, and thank you for this. A great presentation, and of course I think we're all very eager and looking forward to the next one. So on this question on issue of control group as being a way to tackle limitation of this method, so as one of the limitations limitations of the method, they were addressing some levels of uncertainty. What are the true underlying reasons for differences? So observed differences in profitabilities or any other performances. And I think what also Federico has nicely explained, essentially, when we are forcing the comparisons into like groups, so the ones that are very similar in terms of various aspects, those are the elements that are trying to account for those differences, which means that whatever is left is essentially being free to be attributed to the IFFs. I don't think I can essentially provide any further insights into this, and I also firmly believe that essentially, you know, Federico would have a much more clear explanation of how things are going. So maybe Federico, if you want to add something, but otherwise I propose that we continue with or go on to another question. Susan, I would kindly ask you to take over. Apologies, I have some family emergencies. Thank you.
Okay, sorry. Oh, sorry. Please. So, Federico, are you still with us?
Yes, yes.
Yes, there is a hand. Nilton, please. You can give your question.
Yep.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Nilton. I'm from Mozambique. I would like to make a very few questions, Federico. If you prefer, I'll make my question in Portuguese. So, I don't know if you translate right there. Ok, é o seguinte, foi uma belíssima apresentação que fez o Federico.
It was a wonderful presentation done by Mr. Federico, and I've got some questions. The first one is concerning the way you calculate those the way you have calculated all those
para toda a indústria, por exemplo, se a indústria extrativa, se a manufatura e por aí em diante.
I would like to find out if this first question is the way you have calculated the way you calculated all those deviations, if it's the same for all the countries. And another issue which is very complicated, I would like to know how do you use those numbers to generate those results that you have presented there in your presentation. Thank you.
So,
okay, so there is another hand. Would you like to take this one first, and then we'll come to the other question?
Okay, I answered the question by Nilton, or I expect for the other one. I don't know.
You can go ahead with Nilton's question.
Okay, okay. Thank you, Nilton, for your question. I'm not sure that I understood because I was late in pushing the button of the translation. So the numbers, the indicators, the numbers are obviously sensitive to the country. So obviously, data from Italy cannot be used, if I well understood the question, for other countries. So each country have to do this procedure on their own data, and then so the method is relative in some way. So the thresholds are different according to the strata of the analysis. So the country is obviously part of the strata. So if you apply the method to, I don't know, French or Germany, obviously you can have different setups of the variable, different setups of the thresholds, and different setups of the characteristics. So the method is not generalizable to all the countries. There is not, I don't know, generalizable numbers. So how I calculate, you will see in the second presentation, because in the second presentation I give you the numbers for each step, for each calculation, so we can see calculations in the next presentation.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Federico. I think there was another hand. I didn't see the name, but it had an eye with the hand. Kindly please go ahead and ask the question. Okay, I don't seem to see the hand. So, Federico, are you able to go to the next example?
Yes, of course. May I have 2 minutes to take some water, some...
Yes, we would actually do a 5-minute break.
2 minutes. 2 minutes, I
Yeah,
arrive.
Thank
Thank you.
Then we'll come for the next session.
Sorry, but I have a small voice today, so I have to drink. Otherwise, you cannot hear me in 5 minutes. Sorry.
Okay.
Thank you. Yeah, so let's meet in 5 minutes, right, Susan?
Okay. I hear a lot of noise in his mic, so he
okay,
needs to be a bit, yeah. Don't worry, it's not you. Thank you.
Okay. This second presentation, I don't know, Bojan, all the participants have received the Excel file with the data and so on.
So the website contains the presentations and the file. I don't think we were able to essentially use the system with the registration to send a notification, a further notification back to all the participants. A question is, so the link for the website has been posted in the chat as well. So maybe a request to all the participants to visit the website, and under the tab documents, you will find an Excel file that Federico has prepared to be used in today's session. So Federico, would this be okay so that they just use that file? Do you want them to be following the file and working on the computers as we move along?
Yeah, so the idea is to do the presentation. I skip from the 2 files from the presentation to the Excel when we need, but if they have their own Excel file open, they can follow the presentation better. So that is just to say that if they want, in each page of the presentation, there in the lower right part, there is the reference to the sheet of the file they can watch to follow the explanation. So I take the screen.
Yes, please. Thank you.
There was a question from Anastasia. I don't know. Anyway, we can take it later.
Maybe I can. I just see a question. So Federico, the question is, can it be more than 2 factors when we do the factor analysis? So I think I tried to put already the information in my presentation, but so essentially, yes, it could be more than 2 factors. It would depend on the amount of variance that is explained. You know, usually, I think Federico, please correct me. So we're trying always to go at least 80%. So sometimes this could be 2 factors, sometimes 3.
Yeah, it depends also from the there is a matter of easiness of the analysis. When you run this analysis for in our case, we run, I think, for 25 different sectors. If you take 2 factors, you have the possibility to have the condition met for all the sectors. Otherwise, you have to run the exercise 25 times by changing the code, because if you take 2 or 3 factors, you have to change the code. So there is a practical stuff, but of course you can use the number of factors you want. There is no conceptual difference. You can use 1, 2, 7, 6. It depends on the variance you want to be explain, or also the practical stuff you have to deal with when you do this type of procedure. So the first slide relates to the building up of the database. As I said in the preceding presentation, we use 3 informative sources here. The first one is a very huge database which include structural and economic variables for all Italian firms. So there are 4.4 million of observations. The second is the archive containing the information about for all the internationalized firms about their imports and exports. And the third one represents the information about the position of each enterprise, sorry, in domestic and multinational groups. So the idea is that for each unit in the business system, you can have an integrated database that reports a comprehensive information about the economic and organizational structure of the enterprises, their characteristic in terms of inclusion in the network of international trade, and if applies, it's their positioning within multinational groups. So this is the main data set we use. So as you can see, for 2019, Frame SBS contains 4.3 million units. The COETEC database obviously contained the same number of units, but 165 have positive value of imports and or exports. Asia Groups contains 233,000 units. So we impose some limitation to the integrated data set. In particular, we exclude units with 0 workers, units that have value added lower than 0, or when relevant variables are missing, and sectors which have peculiar characteristics such as tobacco production, financial auxiliaries, financial firms, and coke and refineries. In this way, the final data set contains 3.8 million observations. This is an extraction from this data set. You can see these in the tables DB example and descriptive in the Excel file, which is this one. So as you can see, we are this set of variables which are taken from Frame SBS. So we have the ED unit, the NACE code, the sector, the number of workers, the size class, and lot of economic variables. So the value added, turnover, salaries, intermediate costs, and so on, until the EBIT. Then from COETEC, we have the value of imports and the value of exports. As you can see, we have all variables are expressed in terms of 1,000 euros or ratio according to the definition of the variable. Then we have the information about the group. So we have the ID of the group, the type, if Mules is multinational with foreign headquarter, Mulit is multinational with Italian headquarter. So you have the nationality of the headquarters. So if is foreign countries or Italy, and then we have the nationality of the units, which is by definition always Italy, because we are taking into account resident units that are resident in Italy. From this database, we can have some descriptive statistics. So for each sector, we take into consideration, as you can see, I think there are 25 or 26, I don't remember really, it's 24 different sector. We can define some indicator or some variable into domestic enterprises, so non-MNEs and MNEs. For each sector, you can see that, I don't know, in mining and quarrying, we have a total of 1,588 units, 1,497 are domestic, 91 are MNEs. So the first one represent a very small part of value added with respect to MNEs. The same is true for turnover. The same is true, but a lesser extent, for workers. Then the multinational enterprises imports by far more than domestics, but in terms of exports is not so different. The average size is much higher for MNEs, productivity too. Then the value added to turnover ratio is higher for domestic enterprises with respect to MNEs, while export intensity and import intensity is strangely higher for domestic enterprises, but maybe there is a mistake here. If you look at the total, which is these two two lines, you can see we have 35,000 MNEs, and those numbers are the same you found in the graph, in the figures in the preceding presentation. MNEs are more larger enterprises, more productive, more exposed to international markets, but they have a lower value added to turnover ratio. So this is the form of the database. Here you can see the informative source we use to gather the relative information, the relative variables. So the economic and structural indicators, from Coetech, the imports and exports, and from Asia groups, the position, the characteristic of the multinational group in which MNEs are included. So, as we saw, we have three different phases. The first one is the identification. As we saw, we can use 5 different indicators in order to take into account for the nature of the country in terms of the direction of profit shifting. So if profits are shifted abroad, or if profits are shifted from abroad to the country, then the selection, and then the correction. So I skip the individuation of the country because there is a lot of evidence about the nature of Italy, which is a country that tend to generate profit shifting. So profits goes abroad, and the direction of the relative IFFs is outward. So we will see the 3 different steps that compose the selection phase. So we go through the definition of the control group, the between comparison from which we define the proxy variable, and finally the within comparison in which all the MNEs and only the MNEs are analyzed in order to define the final clustering between tax avoiding and non-tax avoiding MNEs. So the first step is to define the set of confounding variables we use in the propensity score matching analysis. As you can see, we define 8 different variables which can be which are represented in this sheet. As you can see, we have the baseline database, which is the one we saw in the preceding slide. Then we join this other characteristic. As you can see, the V1 to VV variable, and then we also join the NUTS2 level at the NACE 3-digit level we use in the definition of the model. Indeed, the propensity score matching analysis is used in this way. So the treated, which is represented by the MNEs. So as you can see, MNEs are 1, while domestic enterprises are 0. This way, we can run the following propensity score matching model, in which we are defining which are the 0 more similar to the 1 based on this set of variable. So V1 to V7 and NUTS2, which is a dummy variable representing the territoriality. As I said in the first presentation, we use the 5 nearest neighbor for each treated units, so for each MNEs, and we have the binding characteristic to be in the same NACE tree level, in the same size class, and in the same region. So you can see in the table outmatch of the Excel file an example of the data set we can have from the propensity score matching analysis. As you can see in gray, you are the row in which the MNE is the given MNE is represented. So the XXX6 ID MNE is have the match with the other 5 enterprise in the same match. So they represent X661 to X665 represent the control group of the X666. The same is true for XXX10 and XXX15. So the software in this case give us the ID match. So it say that X66CX is matched with the other ones. So the ID match is the same for the MNE and all the 5 and domestic enterprise in its control group. Once this data set is obtained, we can run the definition of the proxy. So inside those MNE control group pair, we can calculate the, as you can see, the VV, which was the EBIT to turnover ratio, for all this one to be compared to the average of this one, which have to be compared with the value of the MNE. This way, we can obtain the proxy of suspect. If the EBIT to turnover ratio for the MNE is lower than the average of the control group, so we suspect an abnormal behavior, which can be traced back to tax avoidance. Otherwise, we put proxy equal to 0, and we don't have any suspect with respect to this, the given MNE. As you can see from the table proxy, this is the first results. So for each sector, we have a number of suspects over the total number of MNEs. As you can see, the average on the total overall, we have that 64.2% of MNEs are considered to be suspected of tax avoidance. There are a very large heterogeneity in terms of industry. As you can see, you can step from 55.5 to 89% of MNEs that are considered as suspects. This defines our proxy. So until now, we build up the data set. Then we calculated the confounding variable that have been used in the propensity score matching. The propensity score matching allowed us to define a control group for each MNE. Then we compared the EBIT to turnover ratio of each MNE with the average EBIT to turnover ratio of the control group. This allows us to define a first tentative classification based on a proxy of suspect. This proxy of suspect in some way characterize all the MNEs in the data set. Each of them is characterized by being suspect or not. Then from this data set, we take only MNEs. So we let aside all domestic firms. From now on, domestic firms, non-MNEs disappear from the analysis. We retain only MNEs, which are classified as suspect or not. How we use this proxy variable? So our interest is to detect tax avoidance on MNEs. So we don't have any prior about their behavior. So we have used non-MNEs, the between comparison, in order to have a prior of with respect to the behavior of MNEs. So now we can have a first classification between suspect and non-suspect that have to be refined in order to step from the suspect to the final classification into tax avoiding and non-tax avoiding. Which are the steps we have to do in order to carry out this more important within comparison? The first one is the definition of the variables, which should represent the characteristic of the MNEs and should select the variable of interest in capturing their behavior. The second is the factor analysis, which allows us to step from having 9 variables to 2 factors. Then the definition of the composite that is used in the logit model for the ROC analysis. And then we run the ROC analysis in order to have the final classification that allows us to step from suspect to the final classification. These are the variables we used in the factor analysis. This variable has built up in order to have an inverse relationship with proxy. This is not obliged, but it is better to understand the graphical representation. So if you have an inverse relationship, when you are you have a value lower than the threshold, you are classified as tax avoiding. If you have a direct relationship, you have to reverse the representation, which is less intuitive. So the better is to have a inverse relationship between the bad situation and the variables. You can see from the table DB ROC indicators that we join to the database also those other variables. As you can see now in the database, we have just MNEs. Here you add non-MNEs and MNEs. Here you have just MNEs. So we are stepping from between to within comparison. These are the value of the indicators that are obviously standardized in order to carry out the factor analysis. Then we run the factor analysis. Here you have an example of factor 1 and factor 2. You have the explaining variance. Those values are used as share in order to weight the contribution of each factor to the definition of the composite. So the factor 1 is the sum of this loading by the value of the variable summed up in order to give the value of the factor 1 for each enterprise. The same is true for factor 2. Then if those factors are linearly combined by using the explaining variance as weight, you can obtain for each enterprise a value of its composite indicator. Obviously, these weights factor analysis are run by, for each industry. So we had 24 industry, we had 24 different models to be run. So what we see in this presentation has to be multiplied by 24 in order to have analyzed all the business system. What we do next? We have the composite indicator. We have the proxy of suspects. Then we run a logic model, which has the proxy of suspect as dependent variable, and the composite has covariate. This is one of the model, one of the 24 model, each for each industry. As you can see, we have a negative relationship between the composite and the proxy. Remember, we should have a negative relationship between the bad, so the suspect, and the variable. As you can see, the p-value is very low, so the parameter is very has a high significance. As you can see, the godness of fit of the model is good because he has 82.4% of concordance. Sorry for the Italian, I missed the translation here. But is trust in me, is concordance. So this is the logic model. Then, okay, as I explained, the rock analysis starts from classification problems, which can have different outcomes. So we are interested in managing the trade-off between detecting true positive and false positive. The idea is that rock analysis, which position each observation in the space of this trade-off between true positive and false positive, can be used in order to detect the most efficient cutoff in order to classify observation, taking into account that this cutoff may involve the detection of true positive, but also false positive. As I said, in this trade-off, we opt for a neutral selection. So we give to the two situations the same weight. So for us is detecting true positive is the same of detecting false positive in terms of the relative weight of in which we ask the model to select observation. This is an example of the rock curve. As you can see, when I run the model, in this case, I run a logic model that is it has a area on the rock curve which is 0.81. It means that is a very good model because remember that the random selection is the 45 degree line. So the rock curve is very good in this way. Putting H equal to 0.5, so a neutral selection, as I said, the software give me the ID of the threshold observation. In this case, the threshold observation is 656, and it has a value of the composite which is equal to 0.058488. So this value of the composite represents my threshold in this stratum. So if we see to the Auchi's sheet, you can see that all the areas under rock curves for each sector is or higher than or very close to 90%. So all the models are very good in having a concordance with the proxy of suspect. Let me spend 2 words on that. The fact that there is not fully concordance is good. The concordance have to be high, but not full, because ROC method has also to correct the proxy of suspect. This way, we can also depotentiate the errors we may have done in comparing MNEs and non-MNEs. As you will see, we have a relevant share of change in the classification among the proxy of suspect and the final classification. This is just to say that the ROC method also allows to correct the preceding suspect in something like, I don't know, investigation and prosecution. Here also by sector, we can have the relative weight of the two factors in building up the composite. So there are a few cases in which the first factor is very much higher than the second in terms of weight, but as you can see in other cases, you have a proportion of 60% versus 40%. You can see here the coefficient of the composite from the logit. As you can see, all the coefficients are negative. Take care to this element, because if you have a composite which is not negative, in this case you cannot run the method, because you risk to have counterintuitive or absurd results. So you have to control for a negative parameters, and then you have the threshold value for each industry. As you can see, so to respond also to the preceding question, the thresholds are different for each industry. So for each country, obviously the same, and these define also the different type of contextual situation in which each MNE operates. As you can see, maybe those three sectors are closer than this one. So operating in food and beverage is for a MNE is very different with respect to operate in wearing apparel, leather, or wood, print, and paper. So threshold values are strongly different, strongly differs, and this is good for the method, because if the thresholds were equal by sector, maybe the method were not able to capture also sectoral peculiarities. So when we have the threshold, we obviously have also the possibility to close the within comparison. Indeed, as we saw, we have the ID, we have the value of the composite. So the value of the composite is, in this case, S, big S. So we can compare the indicator of each firm, each MNE, with the threshold, and then if the indicator is over the threshold, the unit is non-tax avoiding. If the composite is lower than the threshold, the unit is tax avoiding. Bear in mind that this is true because we have an inverse relationship between the bad and the composite. Otherwise, this relationship should be reversed. This allows us to have this table of frequency. So in this stratum, we have that 0, so non-tax avoiding are about 40%, while tax avoiding are 60%. This is the cumulative frequency. 441 are non-tax avoiding, 1124 are tax avoiding. Sorry, 683 are tax avoiding. The total is 1124. If you see the table fitting, you can see what I was saying you before. So for each sector, so let's see for the total that is more. Oh. Sorry, but I have to. Okay. So as you can see, if we compare the suspect with tax avoiding, as you can see, tax avoiding MNEs on the total are about 27,000 enterprises, while 33,000 were suspect. So the model tend to reduce the number of tax avoiding enterprises with respect to the number of suspects. This is why I mentioned before the fact that it's good to have models with high concordance, but not with fully concordance, because otherwise, okay, we can say that the suspect is close our word. No, we are interested in confirming or not the suspect. As you can see, overall, we have that in about 80% of cases, the proxy is confirmed, either because the suspect is confirmed or because the non-suspect is confirmed. In about 5% of cases, the suspect is not confirmed. So some enterprises, some MNE, which was classified as having suspect behaviors, is not tax avoiding, while we have also situation in which non-suspect is not confirmed. So once we select the tax avoiding and non-tax avoiding MNEs, we have to step to correction. So the idea is, as we saw, to take MNEs, tax avoiding MNEs, and bring them to the threshold by moving their EBIT to turnover ratio. So to do so, we have to start from the selection condition, in which we saw that the composite for tax avoiding MNEs was lower than the threshold. We need to bring this value equal to the threshold. This can be done by using this equation, which is sensitive to different elements, which range from sectoral contextual element, which are represented by the value of the threshold, and the relative weight of EBIT to turnover ratio and the other variable in defining the composite indicator. Here, the most relevant things is that in this case, we have both sectoral / structural elements and behavioral peculiar elements. So the value of the threshold is contextual. The way in which each indicator affects the value of the composite is relative to the single enterprise. So is a sort of micro-founded behavior with respect to the definition of the composite. As we saw, this equation allows us to define the X tilde, which is the adjusted value of the EBIT to turnover ratio, which allows the composite indicator of the given MNE to be equal to the value of the threshold. And then if we multiply by the turnover of the given MNE the difference between the adjusted and the declared EBIT to turnover ratio, we obtain the amount of the adjustment for base erosion and profit shifting. As we saw, for BEPS generating country, the value of profit shifted is equal to the value of outward illicit financial flows. In case of BEPS collecting, in which the adjustment should be negative with respect to the declared, because in this case, we have the opposite situation in which profits enter into the country. In this case, the value of the inward is equal to the minus BEPS, because in this case, BEPS is negative in terms of algebraic stuff. Here we can see the results. So we analyzed 44,000 MNEs. In this case, they are slightly less than 45, because when we do the propensity score matching, we lost 1,000 observation because of the absence of the right control group. 27.7 thousand enterprise MNEs are tax avoiding. They represent 62.4% of the total. All the MNEs declare this amount of EBIT. There are 113 billion euros, and they shift profits for 38.1.2 billion euros. It represents the 25.2% of the declared in terms of incidence, and the average correction is 1.4 million euros per unit. As you can see, both the percentage of tax avoiding and the incidence of the adjustment is very heterogeneous in terms of strata of the analysis. This is, in my opinion, a good result because obviously, according to the sector in which the given MNE operates, we have different possibility, different setups of profit shifting. So the idea is there are sectors in which the structural and economic setup is more likely to be friend of Beseroso and profit shift friendly with BEPS, and other there are not. So the idea of a strong heterogeneity is good. So this method allows to have a micro level estimate of BEPS. This means that for each Italian MNE, we may know if it is tax avoiding, and if yes, how much they are, how much profits they shift. So we are also able to define the adjustment by country of the headquarter. So taking the whole amount of profit shifting, which was 38.2 billions, you have that 23.5 are produced by MNE, which are headquartered in Italy, that belongs to MNE groups that are headquartered in Italy, but the rest, which is about 10 billions, are produced by Italian MNEs that belongs to foreign groups. And here I cannot disclose the name of the country, but we have 114 different countries in which profits are shifted. And some country is relevant. As you can see, we have 2.5 billion here, 2.6 billion here, 1.5, 1.3, 1.7. So this method also allows to have a geographical breakdown of the phenomenon. Finally, also exploiting the fact that we have a micro level estimates of profit shifting, we can study the different profile of tax avoiding and non-tax avoiding MNEs. On average, sorry. Overall, you can see that tax avoiding are larger in terms of size than non-tax avoiding. They have lower average value added. So 4 millions with respect to 7.1, 7.2. Non-tax avoiding are by far more productive, more than double. And they have lower average turnover. So they have a higher, much higher value of the value added to turnover ratio. And obviously, the average declared EBIT is 1.4 million for tax avoiding MNEs and 4.5 millions for non-tax avoiding MNEs. So the idea is that if you well remember, the value added to turnover ratio and the declared EBIT of MNEs was very much lower than the one of non-MNEs. But as you can see, non-tax avoiding MNEs have a structure of those indicators more similar to non-MNEs than to tax avoiding MNEs. So this is an interesting result because it means that in some way is a way to complete the circle around the procedure, because it says us that, okay, MNEs are different from non-MNEs, but if we take into account non-tax avoiding MNEs, we found back some similarity between enterprises operating in similar sectors. The real difference is made by tax avoiding MNEs, which have a very different behavior with respect not only to non-MNEs, but also with respect to non-tax avoiding MNEs. So my presentation is finished. I hope it was clear, but if you have some question, I'm here to answer them.
Susan, I think you are muted.
Thank you very much, Federico, for that excellent presentation. Quite comprehensive and also very technical. We had a question in the chat, but please, if you have any questions, please raise your hand. We shall be able to take your questions at this point. I can go to the chat and pick one of the questions. I think it was posted much earlier during the discussions. So So one of the questions says, it's by Buye, it says, is it possible to get the codes that allow you to get these results? I think you're muted.
Sorry, I didn't understand very well the question because I was a problem of connection. Sorry.
It's okay. So the question, it was posted earlier in the discussion. So it must have been somewhere in the middle of the slides. So it says, is it possible to get the codes that allow you to get these results? Maybe Buye, you could elaborate the question. Buye, you posted this. Please elaborate.
Yeah. It is possible to have a later question, and I cannot disclose the data because of privacy stuff, but the results are available.
Okay, so probably are the results, can the results be shared?
Yeah, but the results are in the Excel file you have in the system, so those results can be used. There is no problem.
So any questions? Any other questions, comments, please? Just give some time. So, okay. Yes, I see a hand. Is it a hand by Mr. Tuki?
Yeah.
Please.
I'm Tuki Andeshak from the National Drug Law Enforcement Agency here in Nigeria.
Yes, please.
My question is, I'm made to understand they used about 44 sectors.
Maybe speak closely to your microphone. We can't hear you very well.
Okay. So my question
For the
is
volume.
that we were made to understand that about 44 sectors were used in this method or this analysis. Is there any number that is preferable to be used in other countries? Got my question. Italy used 44 sectors. Can Nigeria use, let's say 30 sectors? MNE. Okay, let me put it in the chat.
No, you're now audible enough. We were not hearing you properly.
Okay.
So I understood the question. If I well understood, you can the number of sector you use depends on the number of observation you have. So I decided to use 24 industries because if I used more than 24, I had sectors with very low number of observation in which models are not able to give us the statistical standard to be considered a good models. So it depends on the number of observation. If you have more, I think it depends on the number of multinational enterprise you have. I had 45,000 observation in 24 sectors, approximately you have 2,000 observations for each domain. This is a very limit of the models. If you have less than 1,000 observation, it's very strong to have good models. So the number of strata depends on the number of observation you have.
Thank you, Federico. Thank you, Mr. Tukki, for that question or observation. We'll take another round of questions if there are any before we close the day. Okay. So the presentations are available online on the web page that was shared during the chat. We will keep sending it out to the technical working groups throughout the week. Please visit it and get the presentation that was shared today. I think that's it for today. It's about 12, over 12, more than 12:30. Overshot by today. So I would like to thank you all. Bojan, are you still with us?
Yes, hello. I'm still here, or I'm back. Well, first of all, I have to apologize for not being fully attentive all the time to Federico and everybody else. As I mentioned, so there are some medical issues in the family. But thank you, Federico. I think this was, from what I could follow and from what I understand, you know, a very practical, but also very challenging method, of course, as all of those are, to address the IFFs. But hopefully this will give a sufficient level of insight into the data availability and data requirements, but also the calculation of the method itself. So I think there's nothing further to add from my end, except that, of course, when in the countries you will be applying the method, of course, more and more questions, more concrete questions may pop out. And in those instances, you are, of course, welcome to reach out, and we will try and again together with Federico to to provide any guidance and technical support that we could in order to try and see this method being applied in various countries. Of course, we are very eager to see the results or the actual applications of the method. So I think with this, I think we can call it a day, and thank you again to everyone. Yeah, so that was it. So please also, we'd very much appreciate your feedback in the survey. I think Susan has shared the links. So yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Bojan. Thank you, Federico.
Thank you to all participants.
Thanks, Susan.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Thank you.
Have a good day. Ciao, Federico.
Ciao, ciao tutti.
Merci
Ciao,
à tout le
Amandine.
monde. Au revoir.
Ciao,
Bye
Bojan.
bye. Ciao, Federico.
Ciao.
Au revoir tout le monde. Merci beaucoup.
Goodbye, everybody. Thank you very much.
Bye.